Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NDARC's weekly webinar. My name is Tom Santo Jr. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Center, UNSW Sydney, and I'll be hosting today's session on harm reduction for Indigenous communities, research, and emerging frameworks. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting today and on which NDARC is located. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country across Australia, and recognizing that many of you may be joining from different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands across the country, across Australia. And we also pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people with us today. It's my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Dennis C. Wendt, William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Educational and Counselling Psychology at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where he directs the Cultural and Indigenous Research and Counselling Psychology group. For the past 15 years, Dennis has collaborated with Indigenous communities on research related to substance use, health, and community wellness, and he's published over 50 peer-reviewed articles and received early career awards in qualitative inquiry and theoretical psychology from the American Psychological Association. Today, he'll be presenting on emerging evidence-informed frameworks for harm reduction in Indigenous contexts and drawing on community partnerships, cultural strengths, and lessons from collaborative research. It's also exciting to note that Associate Professor Michael Doyle will be joining us today. Michael's a Bardi man, and he leads First Nations health research at the Edith Collins Center, Sydney Medical School at the University of Sydney, and he's worked in Aboriginal health since 1998. Michael's a mixed methods researcher, and his PhD, which was completed in 2018, was the first by an Aboriginal person to focus on prison-based rehabilitation programs. And among other research, he's leading the development of new culturally informed social and emotional well-being programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prison. And he's worked with NDARC in a number of projects related to vaporized nicotine for smoking cessation with Professor Ryan Courtney, as well as the prison outcome study project led by Professor Lisa Degahart. So Dennis, I'd now like to hand the floor over to you. If you could please turn on your camera and mic when you're ready, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you everyone. I hope this is working okay. It's great to be with you all. I am here in Sydney at NDARC. I've been here since Friday. I've had a really lovely time, and it's wonderful to be with you. I'm in the region for about two and a half weeks, and so I'm grateful this worked out. I'm grateful to Michael Doyle especially for helping this to happen. And Michael's in the room with me here at NDARC, and we'll be having a little conversation later, as well as hearing your questions. Just wanted to acknowledge the Gadigal peoples from the Eora Nation, where we are at, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and especially a welcome to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us here today. I also want to just acknowledge the Kanien'kehá:ka people in the Montreal area of Tiohtià:ke, Canada, which is where I work and live in that area. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward here, and let's make sure this is working okay. Just a second. There we go. Now, okay. We're moving, I think. Okay, just a few things as far as you can see some collaborators of mine who help work on some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about. Thank you to them. Some funding you can see here, as well as and no disclosures of interest. So just a little bit, this is, I think, quite common, especially in research that's at the intersection with Indigenous peoples, is kind of grounding oneself and who am I, and who is this person, and what are they doing here, and why are they here? And so I just thought I'd just say a little bit about that. And you can see a little bit of the things here. This picture of me on the left was me in Montreal, I think my first winter. This is after a walk to work or my commute to work one day. It is, in fact, there is lots of snow on the ground right now in Montreal, so it's a nice little break from that. You can see a thing there. It says chapter 23. This is from a book. I don't know how common it is here in Australia, but it's called Educated by Tara Westover in this chapter. I'm from Idaho, which is where I'm from originally, a state in the Western United States. Please don't hold that against me, but it's next to my background. And you can see me and my brother there. First generation college student from a more of a semi-rural working class background. And it's really in more recent years, as I've been engaging more with Indigenous communities, which I'll talk a little bit more about this, that's brought some more sense of critical thinking about where I'm from and the place where I'm from, and thinking about the traditional peoples of that land, the Shoshone-Bannock of Idaho, as well as some really devastating dispossession and massacres and so forth that have taken place there. So what's brought me to where I am today? In process of time, I found myself at the University of Michigan in a clinical psychology PhD program. Really had an interest in kind of interrogating a lot of kind of the more kind of professional Western senses of evidence-based practice in professional psychology. Didn't really sit all that well with my own upbringing, and I connected with the man you see here on the top left, Joseph Gahn, Grovant, a Native American man from the state of Montana, who was at the time became my advisor at the University of Michigan. And we started to do a lot of work together. It's kind of fun, our names, Gahn and Wendt, or Wendt and Gahn. Every now and then I hear those said together at a presentation or something. It makes me chuckle. But anyway, through working with Joe at the time, I started working, this is about 15 years ago, working with Indigenous peoples in many different capacities, and including substance use health. As maybe somewhat clear from what I've shared already, I'm not from an Indigenous background myself. I come from mostly British, German, and Danish heritage. But I've worked very closely with Indigenous communities for the past 15 years, including many Indigenous collaborators and students. And through different experiences, I found myself in different places. After my PhD at the University of Michigan, I was in, you can see the top right there, in New Mexico for my clinical internship. And then it was in the state of Washington in Seattle, the University of Washington School of Medicine for my postdoctoral fellowship, and now finally for the past 8 years in Montreal. And you can see here, this is probably my favorite picture of the slideshow. This is some of the amazing folks that I work with, students and research assistants and collaborators in our lab. I guess you could call it Cultural and Indigenous Research and Counselling Psychology. A great set of folks, some of which helped with some of the stuff I'll be presenting today. And we've, also collaborate with multiple partners, including First Nations and Indigenous-led organizations throughout Quebec in particular. You can see some examples of that here. So I'm going to be referring, we're taking kind of an international, global, lens here in talking about Indigenous peoples. And so you can see some various terms in which, we would talk about Indigenous peoples, particularly in what we would refer to as the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. There's problems with these names, as with any umbrella terms. There's pros and cons with them. At the same time, for practical purposes and taking such a broad scope, there's some necessity in doing so. And and so I just want to kind of name that in terms of kind of the global versus local tensions, right? That so much of what we're talking about here is really kind of looking at kind of bird's eye view global related things, but in reality, the most important work is on the ground and is local, and so just want to acknowledge that. On one hand, the Indigenous peoples that I'll be talking about today are distinct and extremely diverse people. On the other hand, there are relatively similar histories in relation to mostly British origin, settler colonial invasion and dispossession, and so as a result, that brings some parallel things to talk about, and it's one reason why Indigenous peoples from these 4 countries in particular often are kind of brought together for these kinds of global conversations. And so I'm not going to name through all this now, and I suspect that there's a decent familiarity. I hope that there is among those who are with us today, but just some of the shared factors of settler colonial violence that these folks have faced. And on the other hand, some shared parallels, though obviously quite different depending on the place, in terms of resistance, resilience, and survivance of Indigenous peoples from across the globe and in these countries in particular. And I think that I think it's important to tell this narrative that talks both about the distinctness of peoples, the shared struggles in the sense of settler colonialism, but also the shared strengths, resistance, resilience, and survivance. Which brings me to this next point, to when we talk about Indigenous peoples and alcohol or other drug problems, there's where you start is important, and there's many ways to go with this, and these assumptions that we make for where we begin may have many implications, right? Or one quote that I like to bring up in these contexts is, this is from the musical Into the Woods of Stephen Sondheim, "Careful the tale you tell, that is the spell." And there's been, as I'm sure that most of you have some familiarity with, there's been all kinds of tales told about Indigenous peoples in relationship to substance use. In North America, a common tale is, I don't know if you have a term for that here, but it's called the firewater myth, which is a narrative of a presumed biological predisposition for alcoholism among Indigenous people, which has been debunked over and over. Multiple studies have debunked this over and over. And I think that it's somewhat waning, but it has persisted as a myth, both in broader society and among Indigenous communities, and sometimes internalized to deleterious effect. There's also narratives that are maybe slightly less overt or slightly less overtly racist, at least seemingly so, but that also tell problematic stories. And this might be kind of a narrative of kind of a biomedicalism that like just kind of ignores or looks over the settler colonial violence as well as the Indigenous resistance we've talked about. And just to give us a sense of that, and I just want to just show you a pamphlet here. This is a pamphlet from the United States-based National Institute on Drug Abuse. And this is one of the major funding organization for drug-related research in the United States. And this is a pamphlet. I think this is a very well-intended pamphlet from good people trying to do good work. It's going back a ways now. And you can see here that this is catered for Indigenous people. You see that through the photos that are used. But when you actually look at the pamphlet, it's almost identical to any pamphlet one would give about opioid addiction. You see here it says opioid addiction, a chronic disease. And when we look inside, it's practically identical. And you see some things here in one corner. We see opioid addiction is a chronic relapsing brain disease, like heart disease or diabetes. A chronic disease is a medical condition for life. There is one little line there highlighted that's a little tiny adaptation. Traditional healing and spirituality offer transformative change for some people. Other than that, it's pretty much standard things that really advances a biomedical narrative. Now, there might be some usefulness to some of the information that's here in that regard, but the fact that what is completely ignored is what has brought many Indigenous peoples to where they are in terms of opioid addiction and other kinds of alcohol or drug problems is, I think, deeply problematic. And so I really hope to underscore that with what we're going to talk about today. So where I see myself more and more framing my work from, it's taken me a bit of time to, I think, more firmly arrive here, but is from what I would call a critical addiction lens, a more interdisciplinary critical addiction lens that challenges dominant addiction models, dominant treatment norms, that interrogates power and how addiction is defined and treated and criminalized, that highlights structural factors like colonialism, racism, class, and gender inequality, that critiques stigma and moralism surrounding drug use and addiction labels, that centers lived experience of people who use drugs, and that analyzes drug policy and its ties to policing and incarceration. And it promotes a general ethos of harm reduction. So that brings us to what I'm going to focus on today, harm reduction. Now, I'm going to assume a fair amount of familiarity about just the general principles of harm reduction, but here is just a brief overview. This is a photo of a little training that we did in my lab that was an naloxone training, administering naloxone into oranges, I believe is what that was. But just a brief overview of harm reduction is focusing on reducing harm from drug use without requiring abstinence, respecting individual autonomy, meeting people where they're at, centering health, dignity, and human rights of people who use drugs, supporting practical strategies. That's much of what I'll be talking about today, like safe consumption sites, needle exchange, and naloxone access, challenging stigma and criminalization tied to drug use, grounded in evidence and compassion rather than punishment or moral judgment, promoting social justice by addressing structural issues. So a harm reduction lens is not the only lens or approach that would be appropriate or needed by Indigenous peoples, but I would argue that it is a critical one. And when it comes to at least the more kind of mainstream frameworks that we have to talk about, it's probably one of the better starting places or conversation grounds, at least in terms of that. And we've certainly seen recently, as I'll make more clear in a moment, a rapidly increased attention more formally in Indigenous communities and among researchers working with Indigenous communities in the context of harm reduction. And I think that addresses the great needs in Indigenous communities, as well as changing perspectives around drug use. So I'm going to just give a quick plug to this. I originally intended to share a little more about this review, but for sake of time, I'm not going to, and it's just a little bit off target. But I do want to mention it because I think that some of you might find an interest in it. So, and this is on medications for opioid use disorders, or different terms used, such as opioid agonist treatments such as methadone or buprenorphine, which are sometimes but not always talked about in the lens of harm reduction. So that's why I wanted to bring that up here. So I'll leave that to you for your reference, published recently in the Psychology of Addictive Behaviors. But what I'm going to talk about today is focused on this other review, a scoping review of harm reduction practices and possibilities among Indigenous populations in Australia, Canada, and the United States. And I just got to say that non-capitalized Indigenous, that was not me, that was the journal. It's just like AI or something is taking over these journals anyway, and they do what they're going to do. But anyway, this was recently published in Drug and Alcohol Dependence. And I really want to acknowledge especially the lead author, Camille Zalopa, a PhD student working with me, as well as other authors, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who help support this project. So this was a review where we looked at, we were aware that there was a lot of recent research going on with harm reduction, but you know, in Indigenous research context with these emerging issues, sometimes it can be helpful to kind of try to at least get a little handle on what's going on. There's often great limitations of this in the sense of, in this case, we're focused just on the published literature, right? That what I'm about to present on is not trying to say that this is the state of harm reduction among Indigenous communities. No, this is the research that we can glean based that ends up being published in peer-reviewed journal articles. And that is a limitation of this, in that this does not extend to gray literature. However, I will be talking about some emerging frameworks that are a little more community grounded at the end of the presentation. So we were focusing on studies that focused in pretty much just about any respect in terms of harm reduction, that reported on harm reduction principles or strategies, and that either had separated results or focus on Indigenous participants, or the entire study was 50% or higher Indigenous participants. This was done in 2024 through Medline and PsycInfo. We screened 578 studies and ended up with a final corpus of 28 studies. You can see just a very quick overview of some things here with the studies. Mixture in terms of methodology, both qualitative and quantitative, and some mixed methods. Not too surprising given the topic and given a lot of more qualitative focuses with Indigenous communities. Now, the location is interesting in that Canada clearly is the leader when it comes to the published research in this, especially given that, you know, Canada relative to the United States is relatively small, including in its Indigenous population. One thing, and we did do due diligence on this, we really did look and find, and I've had some consultation with people after in terms of the goose egg for the New Zealand, and that does indeed appear to reflect that in terms of the published literature. That's not because there's not really good stuff going on in New Zealand when it comes to harm reduction. And then 13 studies, roughly half, were published since 2020. So that shows how rapidly moving this literature is. And for the sake of focus, there are some studies that are older, that are like 2003, 2004. that I'm not focusing as much on when I'm presenting here because I'm not sure how current they still are. So I'm going to go through just a few things here, and I'll try to manage my pacing well. If I might go through some things faster than others, so just bear with me with that. I don't want this to be too much of a slog. But 7 articles talked about the basic accessibility and feasibility of harm reduction. And really what was quite clear is that among Indigenous people who use drugs, as well as among young adults, there's really high acceptability in the studies that have shown this. This is included in both urban and rural locations among American Indians and First Nations, as well as Inuit. There's relatively lower acceptability among healthcare providers and non-drug using community members. This result probably is not all that different from just different maybe tensions between people who use drugs and healthcare providers and community members generally, right? So I think that's important to know off the bat that at least among people who use drugs who are Indigenous, there's generally, among the places where this has been researched, there's generally wide acceptability for harm reduction. So I'm going to go through these. Just gives us a little bit of an overview. I'm just touching on some highlights here, just to give some flavor of some of the things here in terms of specific harm reduction strategies. So we can see on this slide, we're talking about needle syringe programs, naloxone and safer supply. These were the types of strategies that were focused on the most in the literature. In terms of needle syringe programs, there's a high use of such in Canada, and in a survey in Canada showed that 91% of Indigenous people who use drugs access to needle syringe programs. There was an Australian study here, rural Aboriginal people who use drugs, where they talked about their preference for hospital-based pickup of needle syringe programs, more so than had that preference in comparison to non-Indigenous people. There's some studies about U.S. tribal communities facing cultural and safety barriers. For naloxone, again, widely used in Canada, 34% of Indigenous people who use drugs are carrying that in the survey. It's a study of qualitative studies showed that it's seen as a community responsibility. There's been training and peer-led initiatives to increase knowledge, confidence, and uptake of such in Canada and U.S. tribal communities. So this gives you a sense that there's research that can give people confidence in moving forward in some of these things in Indigenous spaces. For safer supply, 5 studies on that. These, I think, were all in Canada, focusing on how safer supply has improved quality of life and community connection for First Nations and Métis people who use drugs. There are some mixed experiences that people reported. And there's been some conversation about peer-delivered programs and culturally sensitive models and how those increase engagement, which is not surprising. It's probably something that can be said across the board. Few other things here. Peer support was talked about in several studies, particularly in terms of the value of kinship, mutual responsibility, and peer-delivered services to enhance engagement in Canada and U.S. tribal communities. There was 3 studies on supervised consumption sites. I believe these also were all in Canada. High interest, very high interest, but relatively low utilization, likely as a result of accessibility and appropriateness and so forth among Indigenous people who use drugs in Canada. There's also some criticism in the literature that these sites were often geared to injection use, which limited their usefulness for other consumption methods such as inhalation. There were also some studies on safer drug use education, quite clear among those studies about the value of non-judgmental, practical harm reduction education among people who use drugs. And then finally, the last slide on this, a couple studies on drug checking services. Generally positive experiences, albeit some wariness among First Nations and Métis people who use drugs in Canada. Some wariness just around surveillance and state's role and such. There was an interesting study about what's called the Native Dads Network among American Indian groups in California, and a wellness tour that they did across California where they provided fentanyl test strips and training on their use. There is a couple of studies on low barrier shelters, including one in Australia, that their value in reducing harms in rural Aboriginal communities, as well as one in Canada in terms of providing safe spaces for Inuit clients. One study here in Australia on familial support. Obviously, there's likely other research generally on the value of familial support, but one that we found in the context of harm reduction about the importance of families in First Nations communities to maintain cultural connections and provide practical support. And finally, there was a study that focused on prenatal care, where Indigenous pregnant people who use drugs in Canada found themselves experiencing many harmful experiences from care providers. And a key recommendation there was a request for greater elder involvement to mitigate those harmful experiences. Okay, so I went through that rather quickly, and in the article itself, and by the way, I'll share my contact information after. Anyone who needs access to that article, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to share that with you, and you can get more information there. Another thing that we looked at was how to do with culture, and as is well known, with anyone who does research or does practical work in Indigenous communities, the value of culture, right? And 14 studies emphasized cultural considerations for harm reduction. It's really essential to highlight these, given especially the key harms of settler colonialism have included disrupted kinship and community relationships and disconnection from spiritual and cultural practices. We kind of separated these into three categories. The first, incorporating Indigenous values into existing interventions. So these are, using existing harm reduction approaches. They might be, somewhat Eurocentric, somewhat Western, but you're doing your best to at least incorporate certain things into those. A key thing that stood out here was the importance of elders providing guidance, support, and conflict resolution. There was an interesting study from Inuit actually that talked about how, historically, elders played more of a role, for example, in settling conflicts that now are involving police, and that bring in then law enforcement related, issues in this context where that historically has not been the case. The second group of these is offering Indigenous and Western practices as complementary approaches. So it's kind of having a toolkit that includes, the best of both worlds, including Indigenous and, so-called Western techniques that can coexist in a supportive toolkit. Examples of that, there's a Canadian managed alcohol programs that also, and so on one hand, it's a fairly Western managed alcohol intervention, but it also focuses on reconnecting participants to culture, family, and elders. I mentioned before this Native Dad Network Wellness Tour as well that blends Indigenous healing practices with naloxone and fentanyl education. And then finally, reconceptualizing harm reduction based on Indigenous traditions. This is really much more grounded and reinterrogating, rethinking just what is harm reduction, and acknowledging just the outset of harm reduction reflects Indigenous norms or pragmatism or relationality that already exists, and centering that and focusing more on whatever the label might be used for it, the Indigenous traditions and norms and especially relationality. There's some examples here in terms of controlled drinking, aligning with tribal traditions. There's studies on that in terms of American Indian and Inuit context. Some research on peer networks being seen as akin to circles of trust grounded in long-standing kinship bonds. There was an article on an Indigenous harm reduction approach out of British Columbia and Canada, emphasizing relationship care, knowledge, protection, and healing, as well as connecting clients to elders and Indigenous health services. So my final piece of this is thinking about barriers to harm reduction. Nearly all of the articles talked about barriers to harm reduction, and we categorize these in terms of 5 A's. This is from a framework, and I apologize, forget the author's name of the framework. It's cited in the article. We have the 5 A's: approachability, acceptability, availability and accommodation, affordability, and appropriateness. I guess it's 6 A's. So as you can see here in what I've sketched out here, all of these barriers map onto general barriers you're going to see probably in most populations when it comes to harm reduction. But on top of that, there's Indigenous specific barriers. I'm just going to touch on, you can see my slides obviously, but I'm just going to touch on the Indigenous specific barriers right now. So in terms of approachability, beyond things like limited awareness or legal related issues, our studies talk about stigma, including stigma that can be within Indigenous communities, the need to involve community leadership, the importance of local partnerships. In terms of acceptability, beyond general stigma or mismatched with in terms of social or cultural factors, as should probably not be too surprising, a lot of mistrusts of health services. I want to emphasize, because sometimes that we say that there's mistrust in these contexts, it can seem pejorative. I would say it's actually a very understandable mistrust of health services. A lack of Indigenous providers, as well as sobriety norms in some communities. In terms of availability and accommodation, sometimes there can be issues with small community dynamics. Small communities can be good in some ways. There can cause some issues sometimes in other ways in terms of maybe lack of anonymity when it's desired. There can be concerns with policing or need for culturally tailored or mobile services and kinship networks for distribution. In terms of affordability, obviously, this is a common, barrier generally. But I just wanted to acknowledge the intergenerational poverty and economic marginalization as a legacy of Southern colonial dispossession, which really exacerbates barriers to accessing services alongside government's lack of adequate investment and such. And finally, appropriateness. There's a clear need for more focus on cultural safety, more awareness of historical trauma, as well as peer-led or elder-inclusive models, as well as language considerations. Okay, so just a few things, and I've just really distilled these just really briefly, so I want to have plenty of time for discussion, but future directions in terms of research, there's clearly a need for more research outside of Canada. And in particular, I wanted to mention also published research with Maori communities. Now, I want to be very clear. It's not that I feel that Indigenous communities need to do this research, that's needed to justify or validate what's going on. I'm not saying that. I do wonder, though, if more communities are involved with more research, it could help more communities in as we think broadly in ways to best support and better guide these models. That's just a suggestion. More research that would be participatory, community-based, and arts-informed methods are recommended to better center Indigenous voices. There's really limited impact, like outcome research when it comes to this research, and that could be valuable, particularly longer-term impacts and effectiveness, and clearly more Indigenous-led projects. We're seeing that more and more, and we hope that trend continues. So just practical recommendations. The value of co-designing programs. This was talked a lot in the APSAT conference that I just attended. Co-designing programs with elders, community leaders, and people with lived experience, embedding services in Indigenous cultural practices and holistic wraparound supports, tailoring interventions to local contexts, addressing systemic barriers, promoting culturally safe, relational, and community-supported harm reduction services. So I just want to quickly, this will just take a few minutes, talk I think it will help round out this a little bit. Some emerging harm reduction frameworks. A couple of these are some things that I learned about as I attended the Harm Reduction International Conference that was held last April in Bogotá, Colombia. It was really a wonderful conference that highlighted so much valuable Indigenous research from around the world, including a lot of Indigenous research from Latin America. And I wish I could talk for an hour on this. I'm going to share some key things that stood out to me. One is a little closer to home here from Tuari Potiki from Te Rau Ora. A really intriguing presentation entitled Indigenous Values to Underpin Harm Reduction for All, or Did Indigenous Peoples Create Harm Reduction First? And some things that were said in this presentation were, harm reduction as an international movement is not Indigenous, and as such has not been in the forefront of Maori approaches to addressing and reducing drug harm per se. Rather, Maori have long held values, practices, and interventions that are our own harm reduction. And the presenter talked about this. I'm not going to go through these things, but you can see them here. Several values and practices from traditional Maori perspectives that exemplify what might be called a harm reduction approach, but but before harm reduction never existed as such, right? And so it's interesting to think about that. And this presentation in particular also suggested that some of these Maori approaches can be valuable for the broad work of harm reduction, even outside of Maori and Indigenous contexts. A really interesting presentation also there from Levinson Nino, a Colombian researcher and activist, called Harm Reduction Meets Buen Vivir Towards a Decolonial Collective Integral Governance in Drug Policy. And we framed this Buen Vivir as a compilation of Indigenous knowledges and practices that prioritizes harmony with nature, community well-being, and collective rights over economic growth. It's emphasized what he termed as a relational ontology, moving beyond Eurocentric modern binaries, resisting epistemicide, or the erasure of indigenous ways of knowing. And then he used this to extend common critiques of harm reduction, such as this individualism towards more of a collectivism, or a medicalization of social issues to something that centers structural issues and an interdisciplinary approach. If there's any tendencies in some quarters for depoliticized approaches, this is clearly explicitly anti-capitalist and has counter-hegemonic roots. Criticizing of maybe industrialization or commodification, to centering instead well-being as being primary. And even criticizing what might be a human-centric approach to harm reduction and extending this to the environment, to Mother Earth, to broader realities. And finally, this is a new addition. Jennifer LaValle presented just yesterday virtually at the APSET conference on the co-creation of culturally safe drug checking with Indigenous peoples who use illicit drugs. A really excellent book that's just in its early stages, from Jennifer, a First Nations and Métis scholar in British Columbia, Canada. She framed harm reduction as a decolonial practice that includes how to reduce the harms of colonialism. She talked about drug checking as a relational act, not simply a transactional service. And she critiqued what she referred to as politics of traditionalism, as well as settler notions of purity that have been used to exclude people who use drugs from ceremony and other cultural spaces. So, and just as a final thing, just kind of think through these things here, is kind of, as I kind of am wading through this and thinking through this, and maybe this is not as interesting to some of you as it is to me. Think about, what's in a name, the terms that we use to refer to these things. And the reason I bring this up is as we're kind of, thinking maybe in a more critical or big picture conceptions of harm reduction, even senses of like, is harm reduction even the best term for this? Some collaborators and community members who I talk with say, well, we don't really like to focus on the negative in that way, right? Is that term something that is the best terminology for our community? Obviously, local communities will come up with their own ways and their own thinking, but we can see different ways to refer to different things. Alcohol and other drug use is commonly, referred to here in Australia. Substance use disorder, problematic substance use are some things I hear more often in Canada and the United States. Lately, I found myself talking more about substance use health, something that acknowledges that all people, kind of like sexual health, engage with substance use health, and that could be a valuable framework. Or things like social and emotional well-being that are focused, that don't even have the substance-related stuff in the framing at all, right? But things that I think are valuable, and maybe we can have a little bit of discussion about as we think through today. And I think that is it. So I'm looking forward to our discussion and your questions. And again, do not hesitate to contact me. And if you want the article or any other thing, just let me know.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Dennis, for a wonderful presentation. And Michael, if you could have you join and then turn on your camera when you have the chance. And you can close your screen, Dennis.
So I'm going to do this.
Okay, beautiful. Awesome. So just to start, I thought, Michael, if you had any thoughts, if you wanted to share early reflections just from Dennis's presentation and from overall thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thank you, Dennis. It's great having you visit us out here in Australia, and yes. Thanks for making the trek. We seem to be at different places in different countries. The background upon which Aboriginal health, while the similarities of the sort of British, I think he termed it as a British colonial origin of these countries, there also is sort of some unique differences where we just had our first treaty at a state level this morning in Victoria, which is fantastic news. That's the first. There's several treaties in Canada, and of course we have the Treaty of Waitangi in Aotearoa. And I guess I'm wondering, do you see a difference? It's kind of hard to tease out, but this has got to be part of the context of some of the work being looked at. Do you have any theories or thoughts around how those slightly different systems are affecting what are very diversely different First Nations peoples in the different countries?
I mean, it's a really good question. I don't know if I'm the best person to address it. I can speak a little bit from the context of Canada in the sense of, you know, in some ways, Canada may appear to be, it's a low bar, but, you know, relatively progressive in terms of Indigenous relations and so forth. However, this is a very recent reality. This is on the heels of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. And so Indigenous issues are much more on the forefront than they were prior to then. But prior to 2015, Canada probably was further behind all these other countries, including the United States, when it comes to some of these things, from what I can gather. So what I would say is, I would say Canada's current state of affairs in terms of Indigenous relations is very fragile, and there is a lot of disappointment, I think, in the responses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's on one hand, there's like nice things said from the premier, while the premier on the other hand is battling people in court who are trying to get redress for, you know, residential schools and so forth. That being said, I think in terms of substance use related stuff, because of certain realities, I think particularly what we're seeing in like Vancouver, British Columbia, as well as I think a lot of leadership in Ontario and as well as in Montreal, I think that there's a confluence of things that have led to relative progressivism and progress in research in terms of Indigenous substance use in Canada, perhaps relative to other countries. So that's one thing I'm seeing, and at least in some pockets of Canada, though bearing in mind that Canada is very provincial. You know, healthcare in Quebec is very different than British Columbia, for example. But in some pockets, you know, you have more things such as, you know, like medical heroin, for example, in British Columbia. I don't know how well I'm even addressing your question, but I would say just generally, though, being here in Australia feels a lot like Canada in terms of the way that people talk and think about Indigenous issues in academic spaces. That's my sense.
Thanks, Dennis. Could I just lean in a little bit? Yeah, I agree. There's some strong similarities, but I also, I spent a bit of time in Canada recently, and 7 weeks isn't exactly living in Toronto, but it's interesting. Australia is far more secular. It was my observation, just generally as a society, than Canadians. And I would say the US is more religious again than Canada. And I think some of this does play out in some of the values-based judgment around substance use. And it's, we could have a long conversation about the impact of that. But I guess where I'm going with this as well is the abstinence-based model, which we know is part of harm reduction. It's not in competition to harm reduction. And whether it's too simplistic in an Indigenous terminal for First Peoples, that we say it's related to the sort of 12-step programs, which are great, work very, very well for people. I think they get a bit of a hard time, but if that works for you, that's great, but it doesn't work for everybody. But I think, what's your thoughts around that? Do you think it's a bit of a simplistic sort of explanation that there's this sort of default to an abstinence-based model, possibly because of the temperance movement in Europe, in North America, or are there sort of, have you, your work found that there may be broader sort of explanations around why such a strong emphasis at times?
I mean, That is a good question. I don't really know in terms of the comparison to Australia. Certainly, I will say that certainly yes, in the United States in particular, you have a strong kind of 12-step and more kind of what I call kind of confrontational approach historically. That still exists, and it's still probably quite vibrant in some contexts, and certainly that includes among and in Indigenous communities. And there's many Indigenous peoples in the United States who have really embraced 12-step programs and so forth. And that being said, what I've experienced in my 15 years, the greater proximity in the substance use world is that there is a clear shift. There is, and it is a real one. What I would probably call kind of like the motivational interviewing turn in the United States. Bearing in mind that motivational interviewing comes from the United States as well, from New Mexico. Well, I guess New Mexico is kind of collaborative with New Mexico and Australia, I believe, actually. And you see that. Let me put it this way: even the hardcore 12-step treatment people at least say things differently than they did 15 or 20 years ago. They at least say that, well, no, we're not doing confrontational stuff. Oh yeah, motivational interviewing can be really valuable. There's shifts there in what people say. And from some surveys, there seems to be some shifts in what's actually happening as well. So I would say that there is that general change. And how much that is reflected in broader society is another question, but that's about the best I can gauge.
But from my observations, there is certainly a sort of intergenerational change around this issue, but it's coming through. But I guess I don't know if we open up to questions or Tom.
Well, we haven't had any questions thus far, but just a reminder to the audience out there that you can add any questions to the question and answer box. And also just a quick note that Dennis and Michael are in the same room, so if we do see some looking back to the side, that's just noting out there, which is great to have Michael and Dennis both here in person. But anyway, sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, so thanks, Tom. So I guess the last, it's more an observation and a comment than a question, and that is that given the poor experiences Aboriginal peoples of Australia, Canada, and other nations, or First Nations peoples of other countries, have had of the Western medical system, it's not surprising that those among us who use drugs and alcohol are probably not having a good experience of the Western medical system as well, and have challenges in their own right with access or with having appropriate care. So there's a bigger piece within that. But what I thought was kind of interesting from the talk you referenced was kind of stigma within our communities as well. So judgment within the community about people who use drugs and how that plays out. That can isolate people who are already sort of isolated or marginalised. And I think there's a bit of work in there for us to look at into the future.
Yeah. One thing that I can say that I think a little more sharpness on this is what I've seen shift in the last 15 years when it comes to community views on opioid agonist treatments, particularly methadone and buprenorphine and so forth. And I was a couple of years in Seattle, Washington, which was in the United States, really kind of I think one of the epicenters of opioid overdose, and working with communities there, and given it really was simply a reflection of the great need, the overdose deaths and so forth that communities found themselves where they shifted pretty rapidly in their views towards it, and there was some of that was intergenerational for sure, but a lot of it was as people gained some education about this, as they recognized how, and particularly as they saw people's lives improved through it, that it really made a big difference. And so I think that's the best educational model. That being said, though, when you talk with folks about something like opioid agonist treatment, there still is, I think, a really understandable sense that this is kind of messed up, that the drug companies created this problem. And now they're coming in and helping us in this way. And we don't want to see, and though it was more like we tolerate this. We tolerate it, but this is, and the term I hear all the time in North America is it's a Band-Aid on a dirty wound. This solution on itself is not sufficient. It shouldn't be the solution to opioid, addiction. We need broader solutions, and I think even among people who tolerate it more, there still is this sense of it's ideal that someone's not on this for the rest of their life. I'm just voicing what most people would say when you have these conversations with them, and I think that is all in the context of medical mistrust and the sense of the kind of white saviorism coming in here rather than grounded community centered approaches.
Totally agree there as well. And I think what you had gone to mention before, Michael, as well, probably might play some role in that too, in terms of 12 step in the way that, again, not to pick on one thing, but just in terms of the way that people's terminology and what they've learned about addiction and over time has kind of formed different opinion about it. Maybe that potentially plays a role as well. But yeah, we have a couple of people thanking and thanking you, Dennis and Michael, and just saying that it's good to hear about your experience and experiences. I wonder if in terms of next stages and looking at, I guess not necessarily next stages, but in terms of data being potentially analyzed in terms of harm reduction approaches within Indigenous communities, if you wanted to maybe talk about the importance and thoughts around data sovereignty, and also just how you've seen, I guess, effective or not so effective programs of things be evaluated in Canada, with mentioning the amount of research that's been done there so far.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, I mean, there's good work happening. And it's often good work happening from very busy people who do not have adequate support and so forth. And I'm in a role myself through the Canadian Research Initiative in Substance Matters, or CRISM, where we're trying to kind of bring people together. I think really one of the biggest needs is really just people who are doing different work coming together so they can learn from what one another is doing. That doesn't necessarily require publishing stuff in journals. That can be valuable. But are there ways in which that can be more prioritized? And when I say that, through which there can be different funding and resources through doing that. I do think that there's a lot that people can learn from what we're already doing. But then alongside that, I think what my team is focused on at the moment is really centering and trying to tell truthful narratives in terms of structural determinants of health, how those come to bear in terms of how we see harm reduction. And so really, along the lines of Jennifer LaValle's presentation, really seeing harm reduction as reducing the harms of settler colonialism. And what that means. I know that's very broad and very, very, can be kind of overwhelming in thinking through that. But I think that is the work, right? The work is to reduce the harms from settler colonialism, and whatever that might look like. But yeah, I'm curious your thoughts.
Look, I agree. You mentioned Tom, about data sovereignty, and I think that we'll see more of that, and it's progressing quite well in Australia. What strikes me is we've got quite a good framework in Australia compared to other countries, and my own experience was I thought, I'll go to Canada and it'll be amazing what's happening. I'm not saying they're not doing amazing stuff, but we're kind of in different places. It's not like there's this linear sort of a process of everybody's going to go along here and get to this point and everybody will achieve that. And different countries are in different places. the data sovereignty, which is really about First Nations communities choosing how our data is used, is such an important piece, and they are doing some amazing work in Canada around coming up with the research questions. What is it you want to ask the data, and how do you want that recorded? Yeah, we'll see more as we progress in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of this as well, when it comes to data sovereignty, I'm doing a project right now in connection with, and not all research needs to be in partnership with university partners, but there's so many barriers. A quote from one of our collaborators is that it feels like my institution is fighting against me in doing, community engaged work, doing anything that's like seems to be different, like community engagement or advisory circles, let alone things like, data sharing agreements that data sovereignty with communities can be enormous burdens for the researchers, and the burden's often placed on the researcher and not on the institution that supports them. So that's, I think, a big thing that we've got to do is we've got to be talking to our institutions about how they best support all of us, researchers and communities, in doing this work, at least in as much as academic partners are going to be in this game, so to speak, right? But yeah, that's one just thought I'll share on that.
One just final audience question, if we have a brief minute, but thank you for sharing your research, Dennis and Michael said. And then for those working in community development on AOD harm prevention, are there studies on culturally safe and collaborative approaches to consulting with Indigenous communities about alcohol and drug issues? Are particularly methods that help identify whether these concerns align with community priorities, and how can those insights inform the design of harm reduction or preventative initiatives in general? Yeah, I know that's quite a large,
Excellent.
short
Those are excellent questions.
Yes.
Excellent questions. I suspect there are. I'm not really sharp on them at the moment. Actually, this part of the world, particularly, New Zealand is a leader in that regard. But I am working with some folks in Quebec that's looking at exactly on these issues, and in particular thinking about cultural safety when it comes to substance use that's not even connected to substance use related treatment, just somebody receiving care who may be, in some cases, actually people seeking care who are not using alcohol or drugs, but who are assumed to be. And so all these kinds of things and how those play a role. And we had a very high profile incident of that where I'm from Quebec, with the death or murder, you may call it, of Joyce Chekwan, who was left to die after a stereotype of use of drug and alcohol when she was seeking medical care. So there's a great need for this. I think that there is emerging work on it, and I wish I could say more. I don't know, Michael, if you could say some specific things on this.
Not in 1 minute.
Yeah, not in 1 minute. Okay.
Very fair. Well, thank you both so much for joining us, and thanks to the audience as well for joining us today. And thanks again. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me.
And just noting here, these are our upcoming webinars.